Good morning, everyone. We're so very glad that you could join us today. We know that it's been fairly short notice, but developments around taxation and tax reform in South Africa are developing um, in real time and very quickly at that. And so we thought it'd be a good time to convene all of us today to talk about tax in South Africa. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, my name is Sigwetlane Pamudi, and I am the program director of the New Economy Hub. The New Economy Hub works with campaigners, researchers, community leaders, and policymakers to win us the policy strategies and social benefits that assure us a more sustainable future. What that really means is that we support all of these stakeholders and partners to really build, launch, and land the communications that win us the future that we deserve for our society here in South Africa, but also the world, because we are part of a global community. Today, we'd invited you all to join us in presenting the Money Talks Tax South Africa data. Money Talks is a research initiative that is led by Black Sands Communications and Stack Data Strategy, with whom we are coordinating partners for South Africa. The initiative began in 2022, where we started looking at how people respond across 14 countries across the world, including South Africa, how people respond to issues, messages, and treatments of those messages pertaining to climate change and climate change adaptation investments in our respective countries. We presented this data last February for South Africa, and we were really just blown away by how it has been able to inform and support the various communications campaigns that our friends and partners undertake in order to be able to really help build social literacy and support for climate change adaptation initiatives in South Africa and certainly in all of those 14 countries. Last year, we worked with our partners at Black Sands and Stack once again to support the local coordination of the tax data, really getting a handle on how people relate to issues of taxation in South Africa as part of another community of countries, which our friends and partners will tell you more about as they work through the data, but really then to focus on how we make the linkages between taxation, climate change adaptation, and real meaningful development for our society. Why taxation? What does it have to do with climate change and sustainable development? Well, South Africa, Africa, and the world are not doing nearly enough and are not accessing nearly enough finance to be able to undertake these massive technological and social transitions that have to happen across the world as we move into a more climate responsive new economy. What we want to see, certainly from the New Economy Hub, is a set of these socio-technological transitions or techno-sociological transitions, depending on which way you want to look at it, that are just, fair, equitable, and put people first. However, when the private sector and private interests are most foregrounded in these, that's when we start to lose the plot, and that's when we start to suffer in our societies, particularly from the perspective of people-led and people-responsive development. Taxation is a crucial public resource mobilization mechanism that enables us to pay for the futures that we want, futures that put people put people before profits, futures that see the economy not just as money in lining people's pockets, but the economy as the expression of care for each other in a society. And so in order to be able to bridge the finance gaps and see how it is that taxation might enable us to do so, we have to start by first understanding our relationships with taxation, which is why we partnered with Black Sands and Stack to be able to really get a handle on how people understand these issues in South Africa, whether they see the value of taxation, why that is, and how they want their taxes to be handled to respond to their needs and to ensure that the economy is a caring one after all. Of course, we saw last week the unprecedented happened. The proposed budget was withdrawn in terms of presenting it to Parliament and the people of South Africa to really negotiate, to really debate and negotiate the priorities. One of the key issues that caused this withdrawal and postponement of the budget speech was the issue of a proposed tax reform measure in hiking up VAT by 2%, from 15% to 17%, where just in 2018, we saw a 1% tax hike, a 1% VAT hike from 14%, which had remained unchanged for 25 years prior, to 15%. This has caused great uncertainty and great concern for the people of South Africa. And among the questions that have been raised is, why are poor and working class people being called to bear the responsibility of plugging the finance gap when there are a range of other proposals, including increasing corporate taxation, as well as taxing the ultra-rich in our societies to be able to plug that finance gap. This is an ongoing debate. We would like to bring clarity through the presentation of the perceptions of the people of South Africa as part of a global community of people who are concerned by these issues, so that we can then really be able to focus the debates in a way that responds to where the people of South Africa are. And so without further ado, I'd really love to hand over to Liz Caligari from Black Sands to really just take us through some of the data and really situate what it is that we are doing here, how we did it, and what we need to learn about it, so that we may be able to enhance our communications and engagements with the people of South Africa in the negotiations and deliberations and negotiations around how tax reform in South Africa ought to happen according to the people of South Africa. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sekwalani. So I'm Liz from Black Sands, and we run the Money Talks project. And as Sekwalani said, we're here to talk about the Money Talks tax project, which was research that we ran last year. So Sekwalani's already given us an overview of the Money Talks project. We started in 22, and we surveyed over 20,000 people in the G7. And it's all about how to communicate more effectively, how to unlock support for international investment in climate, nature, and development. In 2023, we were able to expand the research to 15 countries. So you can see the list of countries there in the bottom right. And we did 30,000 people. And we did tax last year. And this year, we are going to be doing Money Talks debt. So watch out for that one later this year. But with the tax, what we did is we first of all, we did a big dive into what's already out there. We looked at how tax was being communicated already and who was communicating it. We had lots of different conversations with people all over the world. We ran focus groups, including in South Africa. Did we for tax? No, I think we did focus groups the year before for South Africa. Sorry, it was US and Brazil that we did focus groups in for tax. And the survey was 10,500 online interviews across 7 countries. It's worth noting that the poll was in field finishing in June last year. So obviously there's a lot that's happened in the world since then. However, I don't think the insights that we get from this have changed. I think they're still good and actually more relevant than ever. So I'm going to hand over first of all to Marina from Stack Data, who's going to talk us through the context.
Great, thanks, Liz. So when we are surveying complex topics like tax and climate development, international climate development and global finance, we really first need to understand what people know and what people think on the ground to really help us frame the communications. So first thing we asked is, which of the following global issues do you think the world should be focusing on at this time? And of the countries we polled, most countries did say climate change at the top of their global issues scale. This was followed by food insecurity and hunger and corruption in third place. Then we had global economic instability and human rights in fourth and fifth. Now, South Africa was actually the only country to rank climate change not first. They ranked it as third. So if we go to the next slide, we can see, oh, there we go. There we go. So in South Africa, corruption was actually ranked as the top issue that they think is facing the globe, followed by food insecurity and hunger and climate change. It is worth saying that 35% on average felt climate change was the top issue. So it's just that South Africa felt that corruption and food insecurity were higher than climate change, not necessarily that they were completely in a statistically significant area in general on kind of their importance of climate change. But here followed by economic instability and educational access were global issues facing South Africa, in their opinion. So if we then shift the conversation to a national level, in the countries we looked at, we definitely get more of an economic picture facing individual countries. So there are some specific differences between countries in the G7 and what we refer to as our emerging economies in this survey, which include Brazil, Kenya, and South Africa. So first, in the G7, we see cost of living and the economy to be two major issues. This is also including immigration and asylum. But if we shift over to the emerging economies, unemployment is really kind of quite a stark priority for these countries. This is then followed by the economy and corruption, which is something we see across all of these three markets. And if we look at South Africa in particular, this was very surprising and also very interesting. Is unemployment had 64% of the respondents thinking this was the top priority facing South Africa at this time. This was the most stark and notable kind of issue, not only in South Africa, but it was 64%, over half of people kind of came together and voted one issue, which didn't happen in any of the other countries. So unemployment is a key issue in South Africa right now. This was then followed by a lot of the other issues we see across the other emerging economies and the G7, which was public safety and crime, the economy, combating corruption, and education. Now, here in the national priorities, climate change and restoring nature were particularly low. They were one of the lowest ranked issues. So kind of how we then frame communications around these issues that might not be top of mind, but as we know, are actually related to the economy and corruption, education, et cetera. So it kind of opens this framing discussion quite early here in South Africa. So we also asked about general knowledge and perceptions of tax and whether people felt it was a priority. So it was on that longer list. In all of our countries, very rarely tax was seen as a top priority. However, it's obviously wrapped into the economy more generally, which is often seen as a top priority. So in all of the countries we asked, only 9% of people felt it was a top priority, and this was even lower in South Africa with 5%. Also, more generally, we asked how much people really felt they understood the tax system in their country. In South Africa, only 30% felt that they really understood. This was right on the average for the other countries tested. We always found around 20 to 30% of people really felt they understood their tax system very well. So then we also, now knowing this kind of knowledge gap and also where priorities are in these countries, we then wanted to see if people felt their taxes were too high at the moment. So in South Africa, over half, 65% felt that their taxes were too high. This was in the emerging economies, we found that people really felt their taxes were too high. This was closer to 50 in the G7, but still most people do have the sense that they are paying too much at the moment. So it's worth noting that only 2% of people in South Africa felt that they could be paying more taxes at the moment or their taxes were too low. So here again, we face a framing issue. So if we go to the next slide, we can see we then adjusted the framing to talk more about the benefits of increased taxation and what that would look like. And that 2% actually rose to 30%, which is a huge statistically significant rise when we say if you increase your individual taxes, we can then spend more on health, education, and other social benefits like the environment and the climate. So framing it in a different way, all of a sudden, the support jumps in a very significant amount. So this kind of gave us a hint that this was a communications issue off the bat, and that the way we talk about these things is essential for how people feel about them. Another thing we found across all of our markets is very low levels of trust in the government to spend tax money effectively. So almost half of the people that we tested do not trust their government to manage taxes fairly or effectively. This is a common issue across all of our markets. It does vary country to country, but overall, very little trust in individual governments on taxation. And 27% of people trust, so 1 in 4 of people feel that they have good trust in their government to spend or manage taxes fairly and effectively. So from here, we've kind of laid the groundwork on what we have in terms of main issues in the countries. And then we wanted to test, now that we understand the knowledge gap and the framing gap of taxation, specific types of taxation and how we can kind of understand communications around them. So the first thing we wanted to know is what types of taxes do people know about? What have they heard about? So in South Africa, probably due to kind of major corporations acting there, we did find that shipping tax was very well known and heard of, as well as corporation tax, which was our top tax across all of our countries. Most countries were relatively familiar with corporation tax. Some interesting ones that we found is, for instance, windfall tax is a very UK specific tax. So it had extremely high awareness in the UK and then very, very low across the board. So it really does depend on kind of what are the taxations that are often talked about at the news in each of the markets to kind of determine awareness here. So one of the specific taxes that we wanted to talk about and understand people's perceptions of was wealth tax. So we did give a nice explainer on what wealth tax is and that it was a tax that very rich people pay. It's a percentage of the total value of what they own, both income and assets. And then we asked, how much would you support this type of tax? Across the board, this is for all countries, 70% supported this type of tax. Extremely high support when you frame it as, you know, these are the highest of the wealthiest people in the country that are being taxed. It felt very fair. People very much supported it. Only 13% didn't know or did not support. So then we also wanted to dig into the types of wealth tax and the way we frame and talk about them. So one thing we tested first was whether we should talk about the wealthy in people's countries as billionaires, the super rich, or millionaires. And right off the bat, we found that billionaires and the super rich were way more supported in terms of talking about taxing these specific groups. Millionaires, I think, is more common nowadays. So people did find that we found much more support in talking about the billionaires or the super rich, just really this class of wealth. And then another thing we wanted to test is what percentage of the wealth gets the most support for a wealth tax. So there's a lot of percentages on the right-hand side, but really what we wanted to test is at what point are people most supportive of this percentage of wealthy. So we did find that in South Africa, and specifically, anything above top 5% of wealthy is very supported by the majority of people in South Africa, and almost half support over 10% in terms of the wealthy. So these are typically people talk about the 1% or the 2%. We actually find support if you stretch that all the way to the top 10% of the wealthiest in your country. So tons of support in taxing the wealthy. So another thing we tested are 2 different types of wealth tax proposals. While not really statistically shocking or interesting, we just found broad support for both of these proposals. So the 2% wealth tax on the top 3,000 wealthiest, raising to 250 billion a year, 80% support in South Africa. South Africa was extremely, extremely supportive of these wealth taxes. Another one we tested was 5% wealth tax on the top 1% of the wealthiest people in the world, which raised 1.7. This also got almost 80% support. So not hugely different by types of proposal, but I think this is also the numbers we're talking about and the types of wealth that this would provide are very similar from an average person standpoint. So just broad support here. And then we shift to corporation tax. So basically in every country tested, we had support for corporation tax. South Africa was extremely supportive. They were the second most supportive behind Kenya here. So 93% of South African respondents also felt that it was important for corporations to pay taxes to the governments of the countries that they are operating in. So widespread support on these corporations need to be taxed and support of corporation tax in general. And so we also asked what sectors currently people felt aren't being taxed enough. And we did see that often in countries, people felt that banks and oil and gas were not being taxed enough as corporations at the moment. This was then followed by social media, shipping companies, and tech companies. So social media is an interesting one and obviously is quite tied to tech. This is something we see increasing in terms of the tax conversation, but people feel maybe based on where they're operating, et cetera, that they're not paying enough tax at the moment. And then we asked about tax avoidance and tax evasion in these countries. So in South Africa, we find that 74% of respondents feel that it is actually quite widespread within their country. So this is happening in South Africa and people are concerned about it. We then found almost 90% of respondents felt that tax avoidance should be punished, and over 50% of this supported severe penalties. So this is a big issue in South Africa. There's huge support for punishing evasion. There's extremely negative connotations that it's happening and they want it punished. Some other things we tested, which got a majority of support, is 60% of respondents feel that companies need to be transparent about the tax they pay. Another 60% felt that they need to be transparent about the profit they're making. And finally, 63% of respondents felt that they liked when companies use their profits to use in benefit of environmental or social issues. We also tested whether communications of companies about environmental or social issues was appreciated by people, and we found that action was way more appreciated, where people didn't really care what they're saying. They want to see what they're doing. Finally, we also looked at fossil fuel taxation. So first, we kind of tested more generally, do you support a tax on fossil fuels to raise money for climate change? So we found in our emerging economies, 74% support here. So this actually was even higher in South Africa with 76% support of a general fossil fuel tax. This was slightly lower in the G7 countries. So 56%, but still over half. But we did find emerging economies are way more supportive of fossil fuel taxes in general. However, very importantly, and kind of leads to what Liz is going to talk about, how we frame and how we talk about these taxations are extremely important because they affect whether people support them or not. So we tested two different kind of polluter pay taxation policies. So in kind of within the realm of fossil fuels, we first asked whether taxing profits of large national or more multinational companies who rely on burning fossil fuels. And we found almost 80% support and only 8% opposed. So widespread support. In polling, we rarely see these kinds of numbers of 80% support. These are huge. This is basically unanimous. However, if we then shift to an individual fossil fuel tax of making motorists pay a tax on the fuel that they are using, all of a sudden it's pretty much, equal support to oppose, with only 45% support and 34% oppose, while the rest are not sure. So all of a sudden the support is almost halved because it's all of a sudden going to impact the individual, not these multinational rich companies that people kind of would prefer to be taxed. And I think that leads us to kind of how we talk about tax. So I'll pass it back over to Liz.
Thanks, Marina. So a lot of information there, really helpful, lots of rich data, and there's even more data that we will share with you. I think you've already had the link to the dashboard shared in the chat, and in that you can have a really deep dive into the data, look at how people respond based on demographics, age, political voting preference and region and so on. But how we talk about tax clearly really matters, but we wanted to boil it down to something that was really easy for everyone to remember. So we boiled it down to this. So who, how much, for, and where. These are the four factors that you need to remember when communicating tax. And who is in red for a very good reason, because Stat ran a special analysis to figure out which of the elements of a different message had most sway on people's support. And far and away, who is being taxed has the biggest impact on winning support for any kind of measure. Who? Well, it's easy, not me. I mean, this seems obvious, doesn't it? But let's think about this. Not me. You need to be specific. We can see how support increases the further away the tax is from an individual. So it's no surprising the proposed VAT increases in South Africa are unpopular because it affects a lot of people. I would encourage you to be specific. Policy people and research people, we've called it wealth tax through here because we know what a wealth tax is. But I would say, don't call it a wealth tax in your communication. Don't say tax the rich. Being rich is aspirational. Being wealthy is aspirational. Be specific about who you're taxing. It is the top 1%, 0.1%, the billionaires, the super rich. Be specific and make sure it's as far away from as many people as possible if you can. And we ask questions about raising taxes in order to raise money for climate change. And we looked at the wealthiest and the highest polluting. And if you say we want to raise these taxes for climate change from individuals, you get 43% support. And if you say we want to raise it from multinational corporations, you get 37% support. Now, that's slightly different from the other countries. So for most of the other countries, it was the other way around. At a basic level, there was more support for raising money from corporations than individuals. And South Africa is quite interesting that it's a little bit more for individuals here. However, this changes as soon as you get more specific. So if you say it should be the wealthiest individuals paying, it leaps from 43 to 62%. Excuse me. And if you say it's the most polluting individuals, it goes up to 58%. And we defined, you can see the definition here on the screen of a high polluting individual as someone that has 2 flights per year and owns a high polluting or petrol car or vehicle. Then when talking about companies, it's important to say we're talking about multinational corporations here. We're not talking about the shop down the road, small businesses, that kind of thing. This is multinational corporations. And if you say the wealthiest should pay, it goes up to 70%. And if you say the most polluting multinational corporations should pay, then that over doubles and only 10% opposed. There is huge support for taxing the most polluting corporations. Interesting as well that when it comes to corporations, people slightly prefer the most polluting. And when it comes to individuals, people slightly prefer to tax the wealthiest. So the next part of our recipe is how much. And again, this is logical. People want other people to pay the same or more than me, right? So that's quite simple concept, but how do you bring it to life? And when we've done all the desktop research and talked to people across the world about this, there's some great examples of how people are doing this. So, for example, the secretary should not be paying in proportion any more than his or her boss. Should a nurse be paying more in proportion of their wealth than a corporation, a multinational corporation? So bring it to life to bring out that principle that you want people to pay the same or more than me. So the next part of our recipe is what is it for? And as Marina's already showed you, as soon as you start saying what taxes are for, you win support. So we've looked at 2 different kind of frames. So a fairness frame, making society fair, and talking about public services. So we asked, imagine that your government is considering raising income tax on the top earners in your country. This would mean that as the amount that people earn increases, so does the percentage of their income that is taxed. If you just ask that question, you get 57% support. If you add on, in order to make the tax system in your country fairer, because richer members of society would contribute more, that leaps to 76%. And if you add on improving public services like healthcare and education, that increases to 78%. So again, quite simple to increase support with quite straightforward tactics. And what's interesting about this fairer concept is there is, the support is so high, it's across political affiliations. But I just want you to be careful of that term fairness. It can be subjective and people mean different things. So it's not about using the word fairness. We didn't particularly test that, but how you describe it. So this is an example here. So in here we said some people have argued that using a wealth tax to tax the very rich would make the tax system more equal because very wealthy individuals would carry a tax burden more in proportion with the wealth they hold. So it's quite a pragmatic, straightforward, sensible description of what of a fairness frame, and 73% more likely to support given that context. And finally, and this is a difficult one for those of us working on international finance reform, but across all countries, no surprise, it's domestic spending will always be preferred to spending in another country. And we've done a lot of research on how to communicate, particularly think about countries like the UK and the US, how you communicate there to win support for investment in climate change development and nature in other countries. And we've got a wealth of information, and the core one is start with what they care about. And we have seen, like, I mean, since we've done this research, obviously with the announcements on US aid, and day before yesterday, the UK government cutting their aid budget, there's been such a shift in this, and you can see in the language, in the narrative that's going on, it's all about what is in it for me, for my country. So there was an article about Costa Rica may not have their aid cut by the US because it's seen as stopping criminals and stopping the drug trade, which is of value to the USA. And that whole transactional conversation is happening. So what I would just encourage you all to do is stop and think. Don't think about what you think they should care about. Figure out what they do care about. And we see this in the research we did last year. We did some polling around climate justice and concepts of climate justice. And what you find in countries like Kenya and South Africa, climate justice is well understood and well supported. In countries like the UK and the US, it's people don't know what it is, or they don't like it, or it's polarizing. In the UK, we know people think it's about court cases and going to court. They just don't understand it. So if you're in South Africa and you're advocating to other countries, think carefully about the language that is going to land there. So that's your summary. Who, how much, for, and where. And we will share, there's a bunch of resources that I'm sure the team will be sharing with you, including there's a dedicated South African dashboard that the link has already been shared for. And here you can see the sorts of things you can do. So you can have a look at the South African data. There's also a global one if you want to sort of compare to other countries. So I will stop sharing there. And we have an opportunity now for any questions that you may have.
Great presentation. We're going to open the floor for any questions that you might have about the research, the results. We will just give it a few minutes. But besides that, this is why we've called you here, so that we ensure that when we communicate text in this season, we are including the sentiments of the public. I think I just loved what Liz said in terms of it's not about what you care about as a communicator or as an activist, but it's about what the public in South Africa cares about and how you communicate to them effectively about what they care about, even in this debate season about text.
Well, and just to say, you can get a hold of us through the team at the New Economy Hub. And if you do have any questions that come to mind afterwards, just get in touch with them, and we're happy to have a chat with anyone. And what I would say, if you go into the dashboard, give yourself a bit of time. It's quite addictive. You get really interested in modeling all different segments think.
There is a question from Tandek.
So Marina, do you want to answer the types of respondents? Do you want to talk about who we surveyed in South Africa?
Yeah, definitely. So we surveyed a nationally representative group in South Africa. We do have a question about individuals' personal wealth that we could look at awareness of shipping tax by that. Don't have those numbers to hand, but it will be in the dashboard. But the general awareness is all of the participants, which isn't kind of done by socioeconomic status. It's just the full kind of South African census population. And yes, in terms of differences between South Africa and Kenya, yeah, there was very similar, a lot of similarities in terms of support for different taxes, what they felt kind of were the most effective messaging, et cetera. The main difference was Kenya, yeah, had ranked tax as a huge issue nationally because of all the protests and fiscal policy issues kind of going on there. So that was, yeah, the main issue was kind of their ranking of tax. But in terms of unemployment being a big concern, these were both kind of consistent across South Africa and Kenya.
Yes, it was only South Africa and Kenya in this survey. The previous year we also had Nigeria. Unfortunately, we didn't quite have enough budget for tax to do quite so many countries. But yeah, the respondents are all weighted in terms of the national population. So there's a couple of questions on that, as Marina said. So it should be representative. Individual taxes based on fossil fuel-based car use. Did you find any difference in countries with strong public transport systems? Did we? I'm not sure we actually surveyed any countries with strong transport systems, thinking about it.
I guess the Europe to the emerging economies differences were probably relatively, I think in terms of when it came to individual taxation, there was just, everyone was very much, as Liz mentioned, if it's going to impact me, I don't support it. So we even had that even more in these kind of Western economies. So unfortunately, yeah, there was no correlation between kind of good public transport and then a more support of fossil fuel-based car tax. Yeah, hopefully in the future, but we'll see.
Okay. We are going to be closing the round of questions. Thank you for the beautiful questions. If you have any other question, welcome to send me an email and I will connect you with Liz and Mariana if there was a need, or we will then respond from our end. But basically understanding how the public feels and what makes them agree to key, creative, effective public policies is very important. We have seen the riots in Kenya last year that highlighted the importance of bringing the community and the public in these type of conversations. So these findings detailed that in the Money Talks study are very important insights to view of South Africans and policymakers to take seriously considerations of these perspectives. So even with us as activists, I think we should really take these results very seriously as to understanding the public and what they would like to see happen. Without further ado, I'd like to just close the meeting and just thank everybody for making time to attend this and seeing the importance of these results and understanding the perceptions of tax from the public. Any other information, you're more than welcome to just send me an email or a WhatsApp. Thank you very much. Anything you'd like to close off with, Mariana or Liz?
Just thank you for having us.
Awesome.